Welcome. How to Change Your Mind and Your Life by Martin E. Seligman, Ph.D. This book serves as the foundational text of positive psychology. Its core purpose is to demonstrate that pessimism and depression are not innate, unchangeable character flaws, but rather habits of thought that can be unlearned. By tracing the scientific discovery of learned helplessness and translating it into the practical skills of learned optimism, this narrative is designed to help you transform your explanatory style, freeing you from self-defeating narratives, boosting your achievement at work and in school, enhancing your physical health, and ultimately offering you a profound, flexible control over your own mind. Chapter 1. The Discovery of Helplessness and Hope. A father stands over a crib, gazing down at his sleeping newborn daughter, recently brought home from the hospital. His heart overflows with a profound, almost paralyzing gratitude for her perfection. As she opens her eyes and stares straight upward, he gently calls her name, anticipating that innate magical moment when a child first turns toward a parent's voice. She does not move. He reaches for a small, bell-filled toy attached to the bassinet and shakes it briskly. Still, her eyes remain fixed. Panic, sharp and sudden, tightens his chest. He rushes to his wife, his voice trembling as he confesses his terrifying suspicion that their child is deaf. His wife does not shatter. She walks into the nursery, claps her hands loudly, and lifts the baby, who immediately squirms and coos. Yet the father remains unconvinced, fixated on the absence of a startle reflex. The mother calmly consults a medical guide, reading aloud that newborn auditory reflexes often take time to fully develop. For her, this is a puzzle solved. For him, it is no comfort at all. He descends into a spiral of catastrophic anticipation, imagining a lifetime of soundless isolation for his daughter, blaming his own genetics. He spends the entire weekend paralyzed by despair, unable to work, while his wife exercises, reads, and attempts to soothe him. Even after a pediatrician confirms the child's hearing is perfectly normal, the father remains trapped in a low mood, only truly recovering a week later when the sudden backfire of a passing truck finally makes the baby flinch. This subtle domestic drama illuminates a profound divergence in human perception. We see two minds encountering the exact same unknown. One mind instantly constructs a fortress of doom, interpreting a singular event as a permanent, pervasive failing. The other mind approaches the unknown as a temporary, manageable challenge. This divergence forms the bedrock of the human experience. Those who expect the worst, who believe that misfortune is enduring and intensely personal, walk through life carrying an invisible, heavy anchor. When confronted by the inevitable frictions of existence, they surrender. Conversely, those who interpret adversity as a fleeting, localized challenge navigate the same harsh world with a buoyant resilience. They do not internalize failure as a character flaw. They see it as an external circumstance to be navigated. This psychological posture dictates our trajectory in the workplace, our academic stamina, our physical vitality, and perhaps even the span of our lives. We are often blind to our own leanings, unaware that a shadow of defeatism might be limiting our potential. Yet, the most liberating discovery of modern psychological inquiry is that this shadow is not a permanent fixture of our nature. The architecture of our expectations can be fundamentally rebuilt. To understand this transformation, we must first confront the raw essence of defeat, the sensation of being entirely powerless. Life begins in utter helplessness. The newborn is a symphony of reflexes, devoid of volition. The cry that brings the mother is not a calculated command, but a biological imperative. At the opposite end of life, we often return to this state, slowly relinquishing the physical and cognitive sovereignties we spent decades accumulating. The vast expanse between these two poles is defined by our struggle to carve out personal agency. We cannot dictate our genetics or the erratic forces of nature, but there remains a massive, unclaimed territory of daily existence where our choices matter. How we perceive our agency within this territory dictates our fate. If we adopt the belief that our actions are futile, we essentially hand the reins of our lives over to circumstance. Consider the tragedy of a brilliant university student poised for an exceptional academic career. She found herself suddenly accused of plagiarism by a jealous mentor, a mentor who had casually shared the very ideas he later claimed she stole. The accusation was a profound injustice. A mind fortified by resilience would have recognized the betrayal, mobilized its defenses, and exposed the mentor's duplicity. But this student's mind was habituated to a different narrative. She immediately internalized the accusation. She convinced herself that her lack of formal citation, however innocent, was indicative of a deep, unchangeable moral failing. She remained silent during her disciplinary hearing, accepted the destruction of her academic future, and spent the next decade adrift in menial work, punishing herself for a crime of circumstance. Her life was derailed not by the external event but by her own explanatory habits. For generations, the scientific establishment largely ignored this internal architecture of human choice. Behavioral theorists insisted we were merely biological machines, mindlessly repeating actions that yielded rewards and suppressing those that brought pain. Psychoanalysts argued we were prisoners of unresolved childhood traumas, doomed to recreate ancient anxieties. But this bleak, deterministic landscape began to crack in the latter half of the 20th century. A new wave of thinkers recognized that human beings are propelled by their expectations, their ability to generate novel ideas, and their conscious processing of reality. This paradigm shift coincided with an alarming societal trend. As the modern world offered unprecedented personal freedom and material wealth, it paradoxically birthed an epidemic of profound melancholy. Despair became increasingly common, striking earlier in life and with greater ferocity. The traditional orthodoxies struggled to explain this. The analytic tradition blamed hidden, self-directed rage, prescribing years of arduous excavation of the past, a deeply flawed approach that often blamed the sufferer for their own misery. The biomedical establishment looked strictly at brain chemistry, offering pharmaceutical interventions that, while sometimes effective, often fostered a debilitating dependency and ignored the psychological roots of the suffering. But what if the profound despair that paralyzes so many is simply a severe, prolonged reaction to everyday setbacks? What if it arises from the mistaken conclusion that we are entirely powerless? What if achievement is driven not merely by raw talent and burning desire, but by the deeply held expectation that our efforts will bear fruit? What if our physical immune systems are directly responsive to the presence or absence of hope in our minds? The answers to these questions began to materialize in a gritty, historic laboratory setting. Imagine a young researcher driven by the childhood trauma of watching his fiercely capable father reduced to a state of weeping paralysis by a series of strokes. This visceral exposure to human powerlessness fueled a lifelong quest to decipher its mechanics. Entering a prestigious experimental psychology program, this researcher encountered a baffling anomaly in the laboratory. Dogs, having been exposed to mild, unavoidable shocks during a conditioning experiment, were subsequently placed in a situation where escape was effortlessly achievable. Yet, instead of leaping to safety, the animals simply lay down and whimpered. They did not try. They had inadvertently been taught that their actions carried no weight. The implications were staggering. If a creature could learn the absolute futility of its own actions, could this be the mechanism underlying the pervasive despair seen in human lives? To prove this, an elegant, three-part experiment was devised. One group of subjects could turn off an unpleasant stimulus by taking action. A second group experienced the exact same stimulus, but possessed no control over it. Their actions were entirely disconnected from the outcome. A third group experienced nothing. When later placed in a situation where escape was easily achievable, the first and third groups quickly learned to act. The second group, however, surrendered. They had absorbed the toxic lesson of helplessness, and this expectation of futility paralyzed them even when the environment changed. The prevailing behavioral dogmas of the era fiercely resisted this conclusion. Orthodoxy dictated that creatures could only learn physical responses through reward, not abstract expectations of futility. Skeptics argued the passive subjects had simply been accidentally rewarded for sitting still. In a masterstroke of experimental design, researchers intentionally rewarded a new group of subjects specifically for remaining motionless to escape the stimulus. If the old dogma held true, these subjects should have become the most paralyzed of all in a new environment. Instead, knowing they possessed a reliable mechanism for control, even if that mechanism was stillness, they easily adapted and took action when the situation demanded it. The debate was settled. Conscious expectation, the belief in one's own efficacy or powerlessness, was a tangible, causal force. Furthermore, this learned paralysis could be cured. By physically guiding the helpless subjects to experience the successful outcome of action, the grip of futility was broken. Even more profoundly, subjects who were exposed to mastery and control early on became immunized against future helplessness. When a researcher extended these exact paradigms to human subjects using inescapable noise, the results perfectly mirrored the animal models. When humans experienced uncontrollable environments, they subsequently failed to act even when the environment offered easy solutions. They carried the ghost of their helplessness into the future. Yet, amidst these profound demonstrations of induced despair, a powerful anomaly stood out. Not everyone surrendered. In every experiment, whether animal or human, a consistent fraction of the subjects simply refused to become helpless. Regardless of the uncontrollable adversity inflicted upon them, they never gave up. This resilient minority proved that the collapse in the face of defeat is not a universal given. It is mediated by a hidden psychological variable, a distinct cognitive armor that protects the mind from the corrosive effects of failure. Unraveling the structure of that armor, discovering exactly what separates those who shatter from those who persevere, became the next great frontier of psychological science. Chapter 2. The Architecture of Explanation. The hallowed ancient halls of Oxford University can be an intensely intimidating environment for a visiting lecturer. In the spring of 1975, confronting an audience populated by Nobel laureates and the most formidable minds in British psychiatry, the challenge of defending a new psychological theory felt akin to performing a high-stakes soliloquy before a crowd of master actors. The presentation on the mechanics of learned helplessness concluded to polite applause, but the traditional post-lecture critique delivered a stunning blow. John Teasdale, a sharp and perceptive researcher, stood up and dismantled the narrative. He pointed out a glaring paradox. While the experiments successfully induced paralysis in many subjects, a consistent one-third of the participants refused to surrender, regardless of the inescapable adversity they faced. Furthermore, among those who did collapse, some recovered almost immediately, while others remained immobilized long after the environment changed. Teasdale demanded to know why. This public challenge, initially embarrassing, proved to be the catalyst for the most significant breakthrough in the study of resilience. Teasdale suggested that the missing variable was not in the environment, but in the internal dialogue of the subjects, specifically how they explained their misfortunes to themselves. To understand this internal dialogue, one must engage in a process of profound self-reflection, effectively testing one's own baseline of optimism. Imagine navigating the daily frictions of life, receiving a surprisingly poor evaluation at work, getting lost on the way to a social gathering, or experiencing a sudden romantic rejection. When evaluating these scenarios, the mind instinctively assigns a cause. The crucial variable is whether you perceive that cause as a permanent fixture of your character or a fleeting intersection of circumstances. Scoring your own mental habits requires absolute honesty. If you tend to assume that a forgotten anniversary means you are inherently thoughtless, or that a rejected proposal means you are fundamentally unappealing, your cognitive ledger is heavily weighted toward pessimism. Conversely, if you attribute the forgotten date to a temporary distraction, or the rejection to the other person's current mood, your ledger reflects the buoyancy of optimism. This internal accounting dictates how rapidly you will recover from the inevitable punches life throws at you. This habit of assigning causality is known as your explanatory style. Following the Oxford revelation, a rigorous reformulation of the helplessness theory began. Heavily influenced by the emerging field of attribution theory, which posited that human behavior is driven by our internal explanations for success and failure. But the new framework went deeper, arguing that these explanations were not isolated incidents but deeply ingrained, lifelong habits of thought. We each carry a fundamental word in our hearts, a yes or a no, that colors our perception of every challenge. Explanatory style is the lens through which we view our place in the universe, determining whether we see ourselves as capable captains of our fate or eternal victims of circumstance. The question of who never gives up is answered by examining the three pillars of this explanatory architecture: permanence, pervasiveness, and personalization. Permanence is the dimension of time. When tragedy or failure strikes, the easily defeated mind assumes the cause is fixed and immutable. They speak in terms of always and never, The resilient mind, however, recognizes the fluidity of time, attributing setbacks to sometimes or lately. If you fail an exam and conclude that you are inherently unintelligent, the pain will endure. If you conclude that you simply used the wrong study strategy for that specific test, the pain is temporary and recovery is swift. Pervasiveness is the dimension of space. Consider two professionals who suddenly lose their jobs in a corporate downsizing. Both experience the initial shock and despair. However, one allows this singular professional defeat to bleed into every other aspect of his existence. He withdraws from his family, abandons his physical health, and avoids social contact, believing that his failure in the workplace signifies a universal incompetence. He catastrophizes. The other professional, while deeply saddened by the loss of her job, neatly boxes the misfortune. She continues to be a loving spouse, maintains her exercise routine, and keeps her social engagements. She views the setback as specific to her career, not a universal condemnation of her worth. Those who make universal explanations for adversity surrender their entire lives when one thread snaps. Those who make specific explanations march forward in all other arenas. This brings us to the very essence of what constitutes the stuff of hope. Hope is not a vague, mystical emotion. It is a highly specific cognitive mechanism. The art of hope consists in finding temporary and specific causes for the hardships you endure. Temporary causes limit the duration of your despair, while specific causes confine the damage to the immediate situation. Conversely, the practice of despair involves finding permanent and universal causes for your troubles, projecting a singular defeat into an endless, encompassing future of misery. The final dimension of explanatory style is personalization, which dictates how we assign blame. When a relationship sours or a project collapses, you can either internalize the blame, viewing it as a profound personal defect, or externalize it, recognizing the role of other people or uncontrollable circumstances. Chronic internalizers suffer from depleted self-esteem, convinced they are worthless and unlovable. Those who externalize blame tend to preserve their self-regard. However, a critical caveat regarding responsibility must be addressed. Highlighting the dangers of internalizing failure is not an invitation to become a chronic blamer of others, forever shirking accountability for your own mistakes. A society of individuals who never own up to their flaws is a broken society. The goal is not to blindly shift all blame outward, but to shift the nature of the internal blame. If you must take responsibility for a failure, it is vital to attribute it to a temporary, changeable factor, like a lack of effort or a poor strategy, rather than a permanent, unalterable character flaw like stupidity or inherent ugliness. You cannot act to change a permanent flaw, but you can always adjust your effort. What if your habitual style leans heavily toward the pessimistic? The consequences are severe. A pessimistic mindset guarantees that you will experience depression more frequently and intensely. It ensures that you will operate below your true potential in your career and academic pursuits. It compromises your physical immune system, and it drains the joy from daily existence. But the ultimate promise of this psychological architecture is that it is not a permanent prison. Habits of thought can be rebuilt. To truly comprehend the stakes of this cognitive battle, one must examine ultimate pessimism in its most extreme manifestation: clinical depression. Depression is pessimism magnified to a terrifying scale. While the normal depressions we all face after a rejection or a financial loss generally lift after a period of mourning, true depressive disorders linger and paralyze. Whether it is unipolar depression, characterized by deep, unrelieved lows, or bipolar depression, which swings wildly into manic euphoria, the suffering is profound. For decades, the psychiatric establishment viewed these conditions either as biological defects to be numbed with medication, or as deeply buried, unresolved childhood rages to be painfully excavated over years of analysis. Consider the trajectory of a brilliant university student, adored by her family and celebrated by her peers. Gradually, a creeping darkness overtook her. She felt entirely empty, convinced she was devoid of talent and fundamentally unlovable. Her coursework became an insurmountable mountain. The simple act of choosing which assignment to tackle left her paralyzed at her desk. She withdrew from intimacy, found existence absurd, and spent her mornings weeping in bed. This is the portrait of a mind dominated by a catastrophic explanatory style. Her depression was not a sudden viral infection. It was the ultimate consequence of interpreting every minor friction as a permanent, pervasive, and personal damnation. Depression operates through 4 distinct symptoms: a negative change in thought, where the future looks impossibly bleak; a negative change in mood, characterized by an overwhelming heavy sadness that is often worst in the early hours of the morning; a behavioral shift toward complete passivity and indecision, sometimes culminating in a desire to escape existence entirely; and finally, a physical breakdown, where sleep fragments, appetites vanish, and the body mirrors the exhaustion of the mind. To gauge the presence of this darkness in your own life, you must test the waters of your recent emotional history. Reflect on the past week. Have you been bothered by trivial things? Has your appetite vanished? Have you felt that you could not shake the blues even with the comfort of friends? Have you felt fearful, lonely, or convinced your life is a failure? Have crying spells overtaken you, or have you simply felt unable to get moving? If these experiences resonate deeply and frequently, you are experiencing the symptoms of an epidemic that is sweeping the modern world. An epidemic fueled not by biology, but by the devastating expectation that our actions no longer matter. Chapter 3. How you think, how you feel. The bridge between a singular defeat and a state of complete paralyzing despair is constructed entirely of thought. For decades, the prevailing belief in psychiatry was that depression was a biological inevitability or a wellspring of unresolved unconscious anger. However, the revelation of learned helplessness fundamentally altered this landscape. Helplessness alone is a devastating experience, a raw encounter with one's own powerlessness. But helplessness is merely the raw material. It is your explanatory style, the habitual way you interpret your helplessness, that determines whether you will simply brush yourself off or plummet into the abyss of depression. When a negative event occurs, such as a severe financial loss or a profound romantic rejection, the environment induces a state of helplessness. But the mind immediately races to answer the question, why did this happen? If the mind habitually reaches for permanent, pervasive, and personal explanations, believing the loss is forever, will ruin everything and is entirely one's own fault. The temporary state of helplessness is transformed into a heavy, enduring depression. Explanatory style is the engine that converts a fleeting setback into a chronic psychological illness. This leads to a critical question of cause and effect. Does a pessimistic explanatory style merely reflect depression, or does it actively cause it? It is easy to observe that depressed individuals speak in deeply pessimistic terms. When a person is enveloped in darkness, everything looks bleak. The true test of causality required observing individuals before the darkness descended. By assessing the explanatory styles of healthy individuals and tracking them over time, researchers discovered a chilling predictive power. Those who walked through life with a pessimistic cognitive baseline were significantly more likely to fall into deep depressions when faced with adversity. The pessimistic explanation actually precedes the collapse. It is the silent cognitive trigger. When the inevitable storms of life hit, the pessimist has no psychological shelter. They rapidly internalize the damage, convince themselves it is permanent, and surrender. The thought creates the feeling. The explanation creates the despair. This revolutionary understanding birthed a radical new approach to healing, challenging the long-standing dominance of traditional psychoanalysis and heavy pharmacology. If depression was driven by conscious, pessimistic explanations of reality, then altering those explanations could theoretically break the chains of the illness. This is the bedrock of cognitive therapy. Pioneered by brilliant thinkers who stepped outside the orthodox psychiatric boundaries, this approach argued that our emotions are not mysterious, uncontrollable forces welling up from a hidden subconscious. Instead, our feelings are direct, immediate consequences of what we whisper to ourselves in the fraction of a second following an event. Cognitive therapy proposes a profound shift in focus. Rather than spending years excavating childhood traumas, the focus is brought to the present moment, examining the exact conscious thoughts that precede a downward spiral of mood. Yet a pessimistic explanatory style is not the only fuel for the depressive fire. It requires an accelerant. That accelerant is rumination. To ruminate is to endlessly chew on a thought, to replay a failure on a continuous loop in the mind's eye. Imagine two individuals who both fail a crucial professional certification. Both possess a pessimistic explanatory style, instantly believing they are fundamentally unintelligent. However, one individual immediately forces their attention outward, throwing themselves into a demanding physical task or a distracting social event. The other retreats to a quiet room and spends the next 12 hours dissecting the failure, analyzing every mistaken answer, and agonizing over the permanent damage to their career. The first individual will likely experience a brief period of low mood. The second, the ruminator, will actively weave their pessimistic explanation into a heavy, suffocating blanket of depression. Pessimism provides the negative interpretation, but rumination amplifies it, ensuring the venom circulates endlessly through the psychological bloodstream. This interplay between pessimism and rumination illuminates a deeply troubling demographic reality, the other side of the depressive epidemic. Across vastly different cultures and societies, a stark statistical division exists. Women suffer from depression at roughly twice the rate of men. For years, theories abounded to explain this disparity, ranging from biological differences in hormones to the sociological realities of learned helplessness in patriarchal societies. While these factors play a role, the most potent differentiator lies in how the two sexes have been socialized to handle sadness. When confronted with a low mood, men are generally socialized to act, to distract themselves, to engage in physical exertion, or even, destructively, to turn to substance abuse. They externalize. Women, conversely, are often socialized to introspect, to analyze their feelings deeply, and to try to understand the root cause of their sadness. While introspection is a valuable human trait, in the context of a depressive episode, it becomes a trap. Analyzing a depressed mood through the lens of a pessimistic explanatory style simply generates more permanent, pervasive, and personal explanations for the pain, accelerating the downward spiral. The tendency to ruminate is the crucial mechanism that doubles the depressive burden on women. The most vital revelation to emerge from this intricate web of cognition and emotion is a message of profound, liberating hope. Depression is curable. It is not an inescapable life sentence inscribed in our DNA, nor is it a permanent scar from childhood. For decades, the psychiatric field viewed severe depression as something to be managed, typically through lifelong reliance on antidepressant medications that often carried debilitating side effects and carried the constant threat of relapse once discontinued. Cognitive therapy shattered this paradigm. By targeting the architecture of explanation, it proved that the mind can be taught to heal itself. Cognitive therapy approaches the depressed mind not as a broken machine, but as a student who has learned a toxic habit. The therapy is essentially a rigorous educational process. It begins by teaching the individual to recognize their automatic thoughts, the fleeting, often unnoticed self-judgments that instantly follow an adverse event. Once these thoughts are dragged into the light of conscious awareness, the individual is taught to treat them not as indisputable facts, but as hypotheses that must be tested. If an automatic thought whispers, "I am a complete failure because I ruined this presentation," the individual is trained to actively dispute that thought, demanding evidence. They learn to search for alternative, more specific and temporary explanations. Slowly, deliberately, the architecture of their explanatory style is dismantled and rebuilt. Why does this method work with such unprecedented success? It works because it directly attacks the root cause of the emotional paralysis. It does not simply numb the sadness or attempt to build superficial self-esteem through empty affirmations. Instead, it equips the individual with a permanent cognitive skill, the ability to argue effectively against their own darkest thoughts. When a patient successfully completes a course of cognitive therapy, they do not just recover from their current depressive episode, they are inoculated against future ones. They leave with a profoundly altered explanatory style. When the next inevitable failure occurs, the automatic thought might still arise, but it is immediately met by a trained internal defense system. The mind no longer surrenders to the permanent and the pervasive. It actively chooses the temporary and the specific, maintaining its sovereignty and refusing to fall back into the darkness. Chapter 4. Success at Work. The corporate landscape often operates on a deeply entrenched yet fundamentally flawed assumption. It assumes that professional success is forged by a simple two-part equation, inherent talent combined with a relentless desire to achieve. When an employee fails, management typically points to a deficit in one of these two areas. They either lacked the necessary skills or they simply did not want it badly enough. However, this traditional calculus ignores a third vital dimension, a dimension that often dictates the trajectory of a career far more powerfully than a brilliant resume or a grueling work ethic. That missing dimension is the individual's explanatory style. When the inevitable walls of rejection, failure, and frustration arise, the mind's internal interpretation of that failure determines whether the employee will double their efforts or silently surrender. Nowhere is this psychological crucible more evident than in the grueling arena of life insurance sales. To sell life insurance is to willingly subject oneself to a daily, brutal barrage of rejection. An agent must call upon strangers, intrude upon their evenings, and force them to confront the uncomfortable realities of their own mortality and financial vulnerability. 9 out of 10 doors are slammed shut. 9 out of 10 phone calls end in a sharp dismissal. The turnover rate is staggering, costing companies millions of dollars in wasted training and recruitment. For decades, the industry relied on standard aptitude tests to filter candidates, attempting to identify the perfect blend of analytical skill and interpersonal charm. Yet, these traditional tests proved remarkably inadequate at predicting who would actually survive the crushing weight of continuous rejection. This crisis of attrition set the stage for one of the most revealing psychological interventions in the history of the modern workplace. The leadership at Metropolitan Life, desperate to staunch the bleeding of their sales force, agreed to test a radical new hypothesis. They introduced a psychological instrument designed not to measure raw intelligence or sales technique, but to map the internal architecture of hope and despair. They measured the explanatory style of their agents, dividing them into those who viewed rejection as a temporary, specific hurdle and those who internalized it as a permanent, pervasive personal failing. The results shattered the conventional wisdom of human resources. The agents who possessed an optimistic cognitive baseline did not just survive, they dominated. In their first year, the optimists outsold the pessimists by a massive margin. By the second year, as the cumulative weight of rejection grew heavier, the gap widened even further, with the most optimistic agents selling vastly more than their pessimistic counterparts. The explanation was elegantly simple. When a pessimist encounters a slammed door, their mind immediately whispers that they are a terrible salesperson, that nobody wants to buy insurance, and that the entire day is ruined. They stop making calls. When an optimist encounters the exact same slammed door, their mind rationalizes that the client was simply in a bad mood or that they caught them at a bad time. They pick up the phone and dial the next number. The optimist's refusal to internalize defeat translates directly into higher activity, and in the mathematics of sales, activity is the supreme currency. To truly prove the supremacy of explanatory style over traditional aptitude, an even bolder experiment was constructed. A special force was assembled, comprised entirely of individuals who had actually failed the industry's gold standard aptitude test. By all traditional metrics, these candidates were completely unqualified to sell insurance. However, they possessed one extraordinary trait. They scored in the absolute highest percentiles of optimism on the psychological assessment. They were super optimists. When this special force was unleashed onto the sales floor, the outcome fundamentally rewrote the rules of recruitment. These supposed failures, armed with nothing but their resilient explanatory style, outperformed the standard hires who had passed the aptitude test. They absorbed the relentless punishment of the market and kept moving forward, proving that a mind armored against helplessness can overcome a profound lack of initial skill. This revelation, however, demands a nuanced understanding. It is a dangerous oversimplification to assume that unyielding optimism is the universal key to every profession. We must carefully examine the balance sheet. Optimism versus pessimism. There are specific realms within the professional world where a pessimistic explanatory style is not a handicap but a critical asset. Consider the role of a safety engineer, a financial auditor, or a corporate attorney. In these professions, the cost of failure is catastrophic. The job requires a hypersensitive radar for what could possibly go wrong. A safety engineer designing a bridge cannot afford to be optimistic about a stress fracture. They must assume the absolute worst-case scenario. An accountant reviewing corporate ledgers must be deeply skeptical, constantly searching for hidden errors or fraudulent activity. A mild, realistic pessimism in these roles is a life-saving, company-preserving virtue. The pessimist's natural inclination to focus on permanent and pervasive threats forces a rigorous, uncompromising attention to detail and risk mitigation. Conversely, jobs that require high resilience, continuous rejection, and the generation of novel ideas demand the buoyancy of optimism. Sales, public relations, entrepreneurial leadership, and creative development are realms where the cost of failure is relatively low, a lost pitch, or a rejected manuscript, but the reward for persistence is immense. In these environments, the mind must be able to quickly shake off defeat and envision a brighter future, or the creative engine will stall. The ideal corporate ecosystem, therefore, is not a monolith of relentless positivity. It is a carefully balanced organism. It requires the visionary optimists to push the boundaries, generate revenue, and drive the company forward into the unknown. But it equally requires the grounded pessimists stationed in the financial and legal departments to anchor the ship, question the rosy projections, and ensure the company does not sail blindly over a cliff. The ultimate failure of leadership is the inability to recognize these differing cognitive styles, and to force an optimist into a role demanding cautious skepticism, or to place a pessimist on the front lines of relentless rejection. By understanding the true balance sheet of explanatory style, a business can stop trying to change its people and instead begin to strategically align their internal psychological architecture with the specific demands of their daily work. Chapter 5. Children and Parents. The Origins of Optimism. School. We often view children as untouched vessels, assuming their emotional baseline is purely a product of genetics, an inherited temperament that cannot be altered. But from the moment language begins to crystallize, a silent, powerful inheritance is passed down. This inheritance is not written in DNA, but spoken in the quiet, mundane moments of daily life. A child is a relentless observer, a scientist of cause and effect, desperately trying to map the rules of the universe. The most crucial rule they must learn is why bad things happen. To map this universe, the child looks first to the most prominent figures in their early existence. Imagine a mother and child caught in a sudden downpour, ruining a carefully planned afternoon outing. The mother might exclaim in frustration, "I always ruin everything! I should have checked the weather! I'm so stupid!" To the adult, this is merely a fleeting expression of irritation. To the child, however, it is a masterclass in interpreting reality. The child listens intensely to the cadence, the permanence, and the pervasiveness of the explanation. Studies meticulously tracking the explanatory styles of mothers and their young children reveal a stark, almost mirroring correlation. The child absorbs the mother's cognitive framework wholesale. If the primary caregiver habitually interprets minor frictions as catastrophic, personal failings, the child wires their own developing mind to do exactly the same. The mother's internal dialogue seamlessly becomes the child's foundational worldview. Beyond the daily subtle conditioning of language, a child's burgeoning optimism is severely tested and sometimes permanently fractured in the crucible of sudden trauma. The landscape of youth is inevitably marked by children's life crises: a severe illness, a sudden cross-country relocation, or the profound psychological earthquake of a parental divorce. These monumental upheavals thrust the young mind into a terrifying state of absolute helplessness. The predictable environment shatters. In the chaotic aftermath, the child must answer a terrifying question: why did this happen to my world? The explanatory style they have inherited becomes their only psychological defense. A child already leaning toward a pessimistic framework will instantly internalize a divorce, convincing themselves that their own misbehavior caused the permanent destruction of their family's love. Their despair becomes pervasive. A child equipped with an optimistic framework, however, can process the pain as a specific fracture between the adults, a devastating but temporary storm that does not define their own inherent worth or doom their future happiness. The crisis itself does not dictate the child's future. The child's explanation of the crisis does. Yet the family unit is not the only architect of the mind. Eventually, the child must leave the sanctuary of the home and step into the vast, complex ecosystem of the educational system. The school classroom serves as the second great forge of explanatory style. Here, the child encounters a relentless, daily barrage of evaluation, success, and failure. Every returned test, every interaction on the playground, and every reprimand from a teacher acts as a crucial data point, feeding the child's growing theory of personal agency. How the adults in this new environment explain the child's triumphs and stumbles cements the foundation laid by the parents. Within this academic ecosystem, however, a profound and deeply consequential divergence occurs, a divergence separated strictly by gender. Observers sitting in elementary school classrooms, carefully coding the thousands of interactions between teachers and students, uncovered a silent, unintentional bias with devastating long-term psychological effects. The battle lines of girls versus boys are drawn not in malice, but in the subtle nuances of classroom management. When a young boy fails a test or becomes disruptive, the teacher's reprimand is almost universally aimed at his effort or his conduct. "You aren't paying attention," or "You didn't try hard enough on this assignment." These explanations are distinctly temporary and specific. The boy implicitly learns that his failure is a behavioral choice, a fleeting circumstance he can alter tomorrow simply by applying more focus. He is taught to externalize the blame to his lack of effort, protecting his core sense of self-worth. Conversely, the feedback young girls receive operates on a profoundly different frequency. Because girls are generally socialized to be more compliant, neat, and well-behaved, they are rarely criticized for their conduct. When they stumble academically, the criticism they receive, however gently delivered, often points to an innate lack of ability. A teacher might suggest, "Perhaps math just isn't your strong suit," or praise them for the neatness of their handwriting, rather than the brilliance of their logic. These explanations are permanent and pervasive. Unwittingly, the educational system trains boys to view their failures as temporary hurdles of effort, while quietly training girls to internalize their academic struggles as fixed, unalterable deficits. In the early years, girls actually exhibit higher levels of optimism and lower rates of depression than boys, heavily rewarded for their neatness and compliance. But as the protective bubble of childhood bursts and the fierce, complex challenges of adolescence arrive, this hidden cognitive architecture is put to the ultimate test. Armed with a pessimistic, explanatory style trained into them by years of subtle classroom feedback, teenage girls suddenly find themselves defenseless against the emotional and physical storms of puberty. They internalize the chaos, view it as permanent, and the statistical rates of depression violently invert, with female depression skyrocketing past that of males. The seeds of despair, it turns out, are often unwittingly planted alongside the lessons of reading and arithmetic. Chapter 6. Sports and Health. The arena of professional athletics is widely considered the ultimate physical meritocracy. We are conditioned to believe that victory is forged purely in the crucible of genetic gifts, grueling physical conditioning, and tactical genius. When a team collapses under pressure, analysts blame a lack of speed, aging muscles, or a flawed defensive strategy. Yet beneath the visible mechanics of muscle and bone lies a hidden, measurable force that often dictates the final score. In the highest echelons of competition, where physical talent is nearly identical across the board, the deciding variable is psychological. It is the collective explanatory style of the athletes. When a team suffers a brutal defeat, their cognitive baseline determines whether they will step onto the field the next day, crippled by lingering doubt or fueled by a resilient, unyielding focus. To scientifically measure this invisible architecture of hope and despair in real-time competition, researchers could not simply hand out psychological questionnaires to athletes in the locker room. They had to develop a new method of extraction, analyzing the spontaneous language athletes used when speaking to the press after a game. By rigorously coding hundreds of post-game quotes for permanence, pervasiveness, and personalization, they could map the psychological DNA of an entire franchise. The battle between the 1985 Mets and Cardinals in 1986 provided the perfect testing ground. Linguistic analysis of their public statements revealed a stark contrast. The Mets operated with a fiercely optimistic explanatory style. When they lost, they blamed temporary, specific factors like a single bad pitch or a strange bounce of the ball. The Cardinals, conversely, leaned heavily into a pessimistic framework, internalizing losses as permanent reflections of their overall ability. The true test of this theory was not whether optimism caused them to win on a normal day, but how it dictated their performance immediately following a defeat. The statistics were undeniable. After a loss, the optimistic Mets consistently rebounded, playing even harder and exceeding expectations in the following game. The pessimistic cardinals, burdened by their internal narrative of enduring failure, routinely collapsed after a loss, performing significantly worse than their baseline statistics would predict. The pessimism bled into the subsequent performance, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy of defeat. Expanding this lens to the National Basketball Association revealed an even more profound pattern across a grueling, fast-paced schedule. In a league where teams play multiple games a week, the ability to shed the psychological weight of a bad night is paramount. Analyzing the language of every team in the league proved that explanatory style was a more accurate predictor of a team's performance against the point spread following a loss than any traditional metric of physical talent or historical dominance. Teams that explained their failures away as fleeting anomalies bounced back and covered the spread. Teams that catastrophized their losses carried that heavy, sluggish despair onto the court the next night. Nowhere was this dichotomy more visible than in the contrast between the Boston Celtics and the New Jersey Nets during that era. The Celtics, a historic dynasty, were steeped in a culture of extreme optimism. Their internal narrative, driven by their leadership, insulated them from the corrosive effects of a bad quarter or a lost game. They believed they were destined to win, so every setback was merely a temporary illusion. The Nets, struggling to find their footing, were mired in a culture of pessimistic explanation. When they stumbled, the organizational mindset assumed the entire season was compromised. The physical talent gap between the two rosters was significant, but it was the psychological chasm that made the Celtics unstoppable and the Nets chronically vulnerable. Optimism did not just make the Celtics feel better about themselves, it was the unseen tactical weapon that allowed them to physically execute under extreme duress. But the competitive edge of optimism extends far beyond the boundaries of a playing field or a corporate boardroom. It reaches deep into the very cellular structure of the human body. For centuries, the medical establishment operated on a strict philosophy of dualism, treating the mind and the body as entirely separate entities. A pessimistic thought was considered a fleeting ghost in the machine, utterly disconnected from the physical mechanics of blood, tissue, and bone. However, the discovery of learned helplessness forced a radical reevaluation of human biology. The immune system, a highly complex and deeply intelligent network designed to detect and destroy invading pathogens and cancerous mutations, is not an isolated autonomous unit. It is biologically wired directly to the brain. When a mind interprets the environment as uncontrollable, falling into the passive despair of learned helplessness, it sends a chemical signal throughout the body. This signal actively suppresses the immune response. In rigorous laboratory studies, animals induced into a state of helplessness showed a dramatic drop in the proliferation of T cells and natural killer cells, the very microscopic soldiers required to fight off disease. When exposed to tumor cells, the helpless subjects rapidly succumbed, their internal defenses paralyzed by the psychological state of defeat. Conversely, subjects who were taught mastery and control over their environment fought off the exact same tumors with astonishing success. Their belief in their own agency acted as a biological shield. The implications for human longevity are staggering. A pessimistic explanatory style is not just a heavy emotional burden, it is a chronic, low-grade physical toxin. Every time the mind internalizes a failure as permanent and pervasive, it essentially commands the immune system to stand down. Over a lifetime, this continuous suppression leaves the pessimist highly vulnerable to infectious diseases, slows their recovery times from surgeries, and may even accelerate the progression of chronic and fatal illnesses. The optimist, by routinely shedding the psychological weight of adversity, maintains a vigilant, aggressive immune response. Their internal narrative tells the body that the threat is temporary, signaling the biological defenses to mobilize rather than surrender. Ultimately, the way we choose to explain our misfortunes to ourselves is not just a matter of psychological comfort. It is a vital, ongoing dialogue with our own biology, dictating not just the quality of our days, but perhaps the sheer number of them. Chapter 7. The Macro View: Politics, Religion, and Culture. Thus far, we have observed the architecture of explanation within the confined spaces of individual minds, corporate offices, and the physical body. But human beings do not exist in isolation. We are deeply social creatures, embedded within vast, complex networks of belief, governance, and shared history. If explanatory style can dictate the physical survival of a single organism or the financial triumph of a single corporation, it stands to reason that this same psychological mechanism operates on a grand scale. When millions of minds align in a shared cognitive posture, they shape the destiny of entire nations, dictate the rise and fall of political regimes, and determine the psychological health of an entire generation. This is the realm of psychohistory, where the quiet internal dialogue of the individual scales up to become the roaring engine of culture. Consider the ultimate crucible of mass persuasion, the democratic election. Every political campaign is essentially a massive national argument over the future, and voters are tasked with predicting which candidate can successfully navigate the unknown. For decades, political analysts relied on demographics, economic indicators, and policy platforms to predict the outcomes of presidential races. Yet, these traditional metrics often failed to capture the visceral, emotional current of the electorate, to truly understand why one leader captivates a nation while another fails. Researchers applied a rigorous linguistic tool originally designed to analyze the post-game interviews of athletes to the grandest stage of all. They extracted the nomination acceptance speeches of rival presidential candidates throughout history, meticulously coding every sentence for permanence, pervasiveness, and personalization. The findings were a revelation. In almost every major election of the late 20th century, the candidate who utilized a more optimistic explanatory style emerged victorious. The electorate, facing its own collective anxieties about war, economic instability, and social fracture, instinctively gravitates toward the leader who frames adversity as a temporary, specific hurdle that can be overcome by unified action. When a candidate preaches pessimism, warning that the nation's problems are deeply entrenched, permanent flaws in the fabric of society, the electorate recoils. They do not want to be led into a pervasive darkness. The successful political narrative is one that validates the pain of the present, but fiercely protects the hope of the future. The optimistic leader does not ignore reality. They simply refuse to concede that the current struggles are a permanent condemnation of the nation's character. They offer a psychological life raft to a population swimming in uncertainty. This dynamic extends far beyond the secular realm of politics into the profound depths of spiritual belief. Religion has always been humanity's primary mechanism for explaining the ultimate unknowns, suffering, morality, and death. But not all theological frameworks are constructed equally when it comes to psychological resilience. Different religions, and even different sects within the same religion, foster entirely different explanatory styles. When a religious dogma emphasizes strict, unforgiving predestination and frames human failure as an innate, permanent stain of original sin, it unwittingly cultivates a deeply pessimistic cognitive baseline. If the ultimate authority in the universe dictates that your suffering is a permanent reflection of your inherent unworthiness, the psychological weight is crushing. These theological environments tend to produce higher rates of depressive symptoms among their followers. Conversely, religious traditions that emphasize redemption, forgiveness, and the temporary nature of earthly suffering act as profound engines of optimism. If a failure or a sin can be washed away through specific rituals of atonement, the individual is taught that their flaws are localized and correctable. The theology provides a built-in mechanism for externalizing despair, offering a divine safety net that catches the mind before it falls into the abyss of learned helplessness. However, the most sweeping and dangerous psychohistorical shift of the modern era is occurring precisely because these traditional safety nets are eroding. We are living through an unprecedented epidemic of depression, a strange paradox where unprecedented material wealth and personal liberty have coincided with skyrocketing rates of despair. To understand this paradox, we must examine the fundamental cultural shift of the last century, the waxing of the self and the waning of the commons. For the vast majority of human history, the individual self was a small, fragile entity. Its value and meaning were derived almost entirely from its connection to something larger, a rigid social hierarchy, an unbreakable family lineage, a fiercely defended nation, or a sovereign, omnipotent God. When adversity struck the individual, the pain was absorbed and dispersed by these massive, enduring institutions. A personal failure was cushioned by the knowledge that the family line would continue, the nation would endure, and God's plan was still unfolding. The meaning of life was located outside the self, but the modern world systematically dismantled these larger structures. We celebrated the rise of absolute individualism, elevating personal fulfillment, self-expression, and individual choice to the highest possible virtues. We shrank the meaning of the universe down to the size of the individual ego. While this liberation brought incredible innovation and personal freedom, it came with a devastating psychological cost. The self became the only source of meaning. When the self is the center of the universe, personal failure becomes an absolute catastrophe. Without the buffer of the commons, without a deeply held belief in God, a unified nation, or a sprawling, supportive extended family, the individual stands utterly naked against the inevitable storms of life. When an individualistic culture is paired with a pessimistic explanatory style, the result is a perfect, deadly storm. The modern mind, trained to believe that its own personal happiness is the only metric of a successful life, encounters a setback. Because there is no larger context to absorb the blow, the mind internalizes the failure, deciding that it is permanent and pervasive. The self shatters, and there is nothing larger than the self to hold the pieces together. This isolation is the true root of the modern depressive epidemic. We have traded the comforting constraints of the commons for the terrifying burden of absolute, solitary meaning, leaving an entire generation vulnerable to the crushing weight of their own expectations. Chapter 8. The Optimistic Life. We have traversed the science of the pessimistic mind, witnessing how it warps our perception of failure into a permanent, pervasive, and personal catastrophe. We have seen how this architecture of despair is inherited from parents, reinforced by educational systems, and amplified by a culture that demands everything from the solitary self. Yet, the final, most powerful truth of this inquiry is the possibility of reconstruction. You are not a prisoner of your explanatory style. Just as the mind learns to be helpless, it can be taught to be optimistic. This is not about the hollow, sugary mantra of positive thinking. It is about a rigorous, disciplined practice of cognitive hygiene, a way of auditing your own thoughts and refusing to grant them automatic authority. The transformation begins with a simple, yet profoundly challenging discipline, becoming an objective observer of your own internal narrative. You must identify the ABCs of your experience. Every time you encounter an adverse event, the A, you must learn to identify the immediate belief, the B that rushes into your mind to explain it. Then you must observe the consequences, the C that follow, how that belief instantly dictates your mood, your energy, and your actions. Most of us exist in a state of cognitive unconsciousness. We suffer the consequences of our beliefs without ever realizing we had a choice in how to interpret the event in the first place. Consider a professional who receives a sharp, critical email from a supervisor. The adverse event is the email. The automatic, pessimistic belief is, I am incompetent, I always mess up, and I will be fired. The consequence is a crushing wave of anxiety, a physical retreat from work, and a drop in performance. By applying the ABC method, this individual learns to pause. They see the email, A, and identify the catastrophic belief, B. But now they introduce a new, pivotal step, the D, disputation. Disputation is the art of fighting back. You must treat your own automatic pessimistic thought not as a fact, but as an external hypothesis that is likely to be false. You must debate yourself. Where is the evidence for this belief? Is it really true that you always mess up, or is this the first time you've received such a critique in 6 months? Is the cause really your permanent incompetence, or is it a specific mistake in one project? Is the critique pervasive, meaning you are doomed? Or is it a temporary fixable issue? When you engage in this internal debate, you provide your mind with alternative explanations, the non-catastrophic reality. This leads to the final stage, E, energization. Once you have successfully disputed the pessimistic belief and replaced it with a more accurate, temporary, and specific explanation, you experience a change in your emotional state. The heavy fog lifts. You feel a surge of energy, a renewed sense of agency, and an immediate willingness to re-engage with the challenge. This is the goal. You are not looking for a happy thought, you are looking for an accurate thought that allows you to continue functioning. To master this, you must keep an ABC record. For a period of time, you must force yourself to document these episodes, writing down the event, your automatic belief, the resulting consequence, the disputation, and the final energization. This is the psychological equivalent of weight training. At first, it will feel tedious and forced. Your automatic pessimistic thoughts will resist being questioned. They will feel like the only truth. But with repetition, the muscle of disputation strengthens. Eventually, you will no longer need to write it down. The process of questioning your own pessimism will become as automatic as the pessimism used to be. This is the optimistic life. It is not a life without failure, sadness, or challenge. It is a life where failure does not mean surrender. It is a life where you possess the tactical equipment to stand up, shake off the dust of defeat, and move forward time and time again. By taking control of the explanation, you take control of the experience. Chapter 9. Escaping Pessimism at Home and Work. The lessons of the ABCDE model are not meant to be kept in isolation. They are intended to be transmitted. As we have seen, the origins of a pessimistic explanatory style are often found in the home, quietly absorbed from a parent's own habits of interpretation. If you are a parent, you have the profound, life-altering power to break this intergenerational chain. You can proactively immunize your child against the corrosive effects of pessimism. This begins by modeling the ABCDE process in your own life, letting your child hear you disputing your own pessimistic thoughts out loud. When you face a disappointment, do not hide it. Instead, articulate your own struggle. I feel frustrated that this project didn't work out, but I realize it's because I didn't plan for this specific variable, not because I'm incapable. I'll try a different approach tomorrow. When your child encounters their own inevitable crises, your role is not to shield them from the pain, but to coach them through the explanation. When they come to you crying because they failed a math test or were excluded from a playgroup, listen first, then gently guide them toward a more accurate interpretation. Ask questions that force them to challenge their automatic conclusions. Is it really true that nobody likes them, or is it just one specific classmate? Is it a permanent truth that they are bad at school, or is it a temporary issue with this particular chapter? By teaching them to dissect their own misery, you are giving them the ultimate tool for lifelong resilience. You are teaching them that their feelings are not facts, and that they have the power to redefine their own narrative. This same philosophy of cognitive reform must be applied to the architecture of our institutions. Just as a child learns optimism from a parent, employees learn it from the culture of their organization. A pessimistic organization is one that treats every failure as a crisis of management, fostering a culture of blame, fear, and secrecy. In such an environment, the only logical response for an employee is to hide mistakes, deflect responsibility, and avoid taking the risks necessary for innovation. An optimistic organization, conversely, is built on the foundation of the ABCs. It treats failures as data, valuable temporary feedback that must be analyzed and learned from, not as permanent indictments of individual character. Leaders of such organizations prioritize the psychological safety of their teams. They encourage open, honest communication about what went wrong, but they strictly focus that conversation on the specific, changeable variables that can be improved. They do not tolerate the kind of pervasive, personal blame that destroys morale and paralyzes action. When a company faces a massive decline in market share, a pessimistic organization descends into a culture of scapegoating, firing personnel to appease the fear of shareholders. An optimistic organization brings its teams together to conduct an ABC review of the situation. They ask, what were the specific external conditions we failed to adapt to? What specific internal strategies were flawed? They strip away the personal, permanent interpretations of the failure and leave only the clear, specific truths that can be addressed through new training, new processes, or new product development. By restructuring the organization's explanatory style, you do not just change how people feel, you change how they act. You transform a workforce from a collection of paralyzed individuals into a cohesive, resilient team capable of adapting to even the most chaotic, fast-moving markets. Chapter 10. The Future of Flexible Optimism. We have reached the culmination of this journey, where the science of optimism meets the art of living. A common criticism, often leveled by the skeptical or the cynical, is that the pursuit of optimism is merely an invitation to live in a state of delusion, to walk through a burning building convinced the flames are a delightful warmth. This is a profound misunderstanding. The goal of this book has never been to cultivate a mindless, toxic positivity that ignores the harsh realities of the human condition. Life is filled with genuine, inescapable, and often devastating adversity. To ignore these realities is not to be optimistic, it is to be dangerously naive. The ultimate psychological maturity is not the adoption of permanent optimism, but the cultivation of flexible optimism. Flexible optimism is a refined, sophisticated cognitive state. It is the ability to know precisely when to deploy your optimistic armor and when to set it aside. It requires the wisdom to distinguish between the situations where your explanatory style matters and the situations where it does not. There are moments in the human experience that demand a clear-eyed, cold, and even pessimistic assessment of reality. If you are a surgeon preparing for a high-risk operation, you do not want an optimistic, sunny assessment of the patient's vitals. You want a rigorous, skeptical, worst-case scenario analysis. If you are a pilot checking your instruments before takeoff, you do not want to assume everything is fine. You want to actively search for the single, permanent, pervasive flaw that could cause a disaster. In these realms, pessimism is a virtue. It is a necessary tool for survival, for safety, and for professional excellence. Flexible optimism is the capacity to drop your defenses when you are safe, to lean into the joy of the present, and to believe in your own agency when you are attempting to innovate, build, or grow, and then to consciously and intentionally switch to a skeptical, cautious, and analytic mode when you are guarding against risk or evaluating the potential for catastrophe. This is the waxing and waning of the self. You must be the master of your own internal landscape, capable of shifting your perspective to match the demands of the environment. This is the freedom that learned optimism ultimately promises. It is not the freedom from pain or from failure. Those are immutable components of the human experience. It is the freedom from the tyranny of your own automatic thoughts. It is the power to choose how you perceive your place in the world. When you understand the mechanisms of helplessness, you recognize that your despair is not a reflection of your worth, but a flaw in your explanatory software, a flaw that you can now override. You now possess the tools to audit your own beliefs, to challenge the automatic voice that tells you this is forever, and to replace it with the accurate, empowering truth that this is a challenge I can navigate. By practicing flexible optimism, you do not just survive the inevitable blows of life, you transform them. You become an active participant in your own evolution, capable of rebounding from the lowest lows and reaching for the highest highs with a mind that is clear, resilient, and profoundly your own. You have the power to change your mind, and in doing so, you change your life.